Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. In this session, we'll be talking about using communication and outreach concepts and techniques to motivate action and change for the environment, something I like to call creating a conservation movement. So we'll dive right in on why people will do things. This is the very important aspect of motivating change, is understanding what it is that actually prompts people to get up and do something and go through the journey all the way into behavior change. And I want to start with an example. This is somewhat of a social phenomenon that you see at sporting events, and it's called the wave. And if you've ever seen this, you've often been sitting in a stadium or an arena and have suddenly seen this movement of people getting out of their chairs and raising their arms in the formation of a wave, because it really flows around the entire circle of a stadium or arena. And typically, this social phenomenon starts in a very similar pattern. It usually starts with just a few people, a few folks willing to get up and take that risk and try to start the wave. And they don't know if it's going to catch on. They don't know if they might end up looking a little dumb by getting up and raising their arms and nobody else does it. That's a big, social risk factor that they take, but they do it anyway. They're willing to go out there and try to start the wave. And then we see a whole bunch of other people start to follow these first ones out of the gate. And I like to use the Minions example here. Is everyone, oh, look, somebody's starting a wave. I can't wait until it comes over to where I am, and I'm going to get out of my seat and join this wave. So there's this sort of movement of excitement around it. And that's really when that wave starts to grow and starts to expand and even starts to fill in those gaps. So you really see it moving around the stadium. And then you may have some folks, and I'll be honest, I fall into this category. And this is Stanley from the TV show The Office at a standing ovation, being like, oh, goodness, are we really doing this? And like I said, I fall into that category of, oh, goodness, the wave is starting, and I think it's coming over to my section, and I'll let it pass a few times without standing up. And then eventually I decide I'm the only person still sitting down. I should probably just get up and join the wave next time, because I don't want to look like I'm not participating. I don't want to be the odd person out. I just don't really feel like getting out of my chair, but ultimately I join, just like Stanley is doing here. I'm excited to share that there's actually a theory that describes what we see in the wave when it happens in a stadium. And it's called the diffusion of innovation theory. It was created in the 70s by a gentleman named Everett Rogers. And it was created to describe how, why, and at what rate new ideas and technology spread across a community of people. We've also seen this be very applicable to describe how behaviors and actions spread through a community of people, in particular for conservation as well. And it starts with this small group of risk takers, just like we saw with the wave example. They may not know if this thing's going to take off or not. They may not know if others will follow them, but they're willing to go out there and take that risk. And we would call those the innovators. Right after the innovators are the early adopters, and that's the handful of pockets of people that came up in the wave right after those first few started it. It's a slightly larger group, a bit more selective, and they require a bit more social proof before they jump on board. So they're not going to be the first ones, but they will definitely be the second ones. Overall, this is still a fairly small group of people. But after those groups kind of start this movement, you see a much larger group get on board, and that's the early majority. And think of the minions in that sense. Oh, this is happening, I'm so excited, I'm going to get on board. So they wait longer to see if this is actually happening. So they're a little more risk adverse. They don't want to be the first ones. So they want to see if this is really going to happen, if it's going to stick. If we're talking about technology, they want to make sure it's worked out all the bugs before they spend any money on it. And they will often wait to hear what other opinion leaders think about a certain trend before they get on board. Ultimately, they want to be sure that it's not a fad and that it's actually a new trend and a new shift in norm. once you have the early majority on board, essentially 50% of this population has now adopted a new idea or a new norm. And we see the rate of adoption really increase at that point. This whole middle area just really speeds up the rate of adoption once the early majority is on board. The late majority is another large segment of the population, and they're much more risk adverse. They really hold out and wait until nearly everyone else has already done this before they join, and they tend to join not necessarily because they want to, but it's become such a pain for them at that point to not conform. And you see that with Stanley and even my own example doing the wave. I'm now looking like the odd person out because I'm not joining, and that's not my intention. So I'd rather just join than be the odd one out. And this last group is the laggards. So we see before we get to the laggards that you have about 85% of the population adopting a norm. You can basically consider that a new social norm at that point. And we still have this lingering group, the laggards. These are individuals who may never adopt, either because they don't want to, so they're stubborn and sticking to their ways, they're not going to change, or they can't adopt. And that's typically because of access and infrastructure. It prevents them from being able to adopt a technology or a certain behavior or trend. So this entire diffusion of innovation theory really describes how movements start and how they move and grow. And it can happen very quickly, or it can take a really long time. So this time element at the bottom doesn't have set increments because depending on what's being adopted, depending on the size of the population, which is also variable, could be a small group of friends, could be national or global, each of those variables will shift how long something takes. There are some trends we've seen take an incredibly long amount of time to increase in adoption. And some things, like the wave, can happen seemingly in seconds. So I really love this theory to describe how movements happen. We can also use this information to design our movements to follow a similar pattern. And mainly why this works is because we are a social herd species. We are very much influenced by the people around us, whether those are individuals in our inner circles, like our families, our close friends, our peers, our colleagues, or even folks in a much wider circle, people on social media and the news, or even strangers in the situations that we're in. All of those individuals around us can have an impact on our own behaviors and our own perceptions of social norms. Now, we've seen this diffusion theory play out in things like adoption of cell phone use across the world. That got replaced by the adoption of smartphones, which eventually replaced the technology, had a similar diffusion curve. We're seeing the beginnings of this in plant-based diets, which is exciting. I am very much interested to see how this continues to grow and if it continues to climb up that diffusion curve. Right now, it looks like it's at that sort of bottom level where we are at innovators, early adopters, and maybe early majority. Maybe we're creeping up into early majorities at this point. This is searches for veganism online. The chart on the right is number of menus featuring a plant-based option. It's beginning to grow, and certainly one can help influence the other. We also saw it in Facebook, and we're seeing it in ad blockers, which is something that can actually impact the success of Facebook on the left. So again, these things can even work against one another as well. And we see the same trend and diffusion curve play out even among things that we're not big fans of or that work against the things that we are trying to achieve, like the growth in plastic bottle sales. And that really exploded from 1998 to 2010, again, follows that same curve. And as a joke, I like to include this as well. The number of CrossFit franchises and affiliations that are happening is also following this curve. And it's a joke because I believe CrossFit's basically a fitness cult. It's growing quickly. Now, underlying this diffusion curve are 4 categories of motivators that we can leverage in our communication and outreach approaches to start and grow and even maintain those kinds of movements. And that includes other people are doing it. It's easy and fun to do, and it has an impact. I'm part of something bigger, and it benefits me personally. And I'll be talking about each of these next. Other people are doing it. This is Snoop, and he's actually giving out Beyond Sausage sandwiches at Dunkin' Donuts. He spent a whole day driving around a truck and visiting stores doing this. And Beyond Sausage, for those who don't know, is a plant-based meat alternative. So he's definitely a celebrity influencer sharing this new approach of plant-based eating. More to come on that. So other people are doing it can include things like descriptive and injunctive norms. Descriptive norms describe how others are behaving in a similar setting. Some of these things we know intuitively because we were raised that way, like which side of the street to walk on, or staring at the numbers when you're in an elevator. And there's also injunctive norms, which is behaviors that are perceived as being approved or being not approved by others. So those would, in essence, be considered what's the right behaviors to do. And this example here is from the last several years, actually, energy companies looking to incorporate different behavioral economic techniques that can shift behaviors. And home energy usage has been a real focus of that. This is an example of a bill that one would get to show how your energy use compares to other people around you. This very much gets into what other people are doing. Now, interestingly, this uses both descriptive and injunctive norms. The descriptive norm here shows what all neighbors are doing. That's actually kind of highest usage there. Whereas the injunctive norm shows the most efficient neighbors, which gives an indicator, almost virtue signaling, of what the right or the good behavior here is. And as the U, the blue bar in the middle, you're actually signaled to say, I want to be more like the efficient neighbor because that feels like the right place to be or the good place to be. So interestingly, in this example, they use descriptive norms against injunctive. Injunctive norms can be very, very powerful. Descriptive norms, when the numbers are in your favor, can also be very powerful. Oftentimes, especially when we're looking to change new behaviors, and especially for conservation, we don't always have those numbers on our side. Luckily, there has been newer research on an even more powerful norm called dynamic norms. And dynamic norms is when you show or tell what other people are trying to do more of. So it may not be 80% of people have already done this, but just people are beginning to try to do this more. And this is described as just learning that other people are changing can create all these psychological processes that further motivate change. And we begin to think that change is possible, that change is important, and that norms will be different. In essence, change is happening, or it seems like it's starting to happen, and maybe I should get on board. And this is an example of that. More and more New Yorkers are carrying reusable bags. So again, they don't have the numbers yet. They don't have 70% do it. But people are trying to do this, and it does instigate the idea that maybe this is something I should try to do as well. Related to the Snoop example, influencers also fall into the category of other people are doing it. And this is, a way of featuring messengers who are admired and respected by the audience to share the message or send the message of change, of the new path forward, even of the injunctive norm. Example of Beyonce and Jay-Z will give you free concert tickets for going vegan. How they verify that, no idea, but it's out there and it does get people thinking, maybe this is something I should do too. Now, influencers don't always have to be celebrities. And I included the example on the left. These are groups started by regular folks who saw a need, saw a gap, and are creating their own movements. And this is a whole growth of relatable influencers. Your average person who is doing something admirable and great that we respect and we look up to, and they too can be influencers for our messages. And it's important to consider these influencers because our own organizations, typically, government agencies or nonprofits, aren't always the most effective messenger. They may not always be the most trusted messenger of the change that we're seeking. So are there other influencers out there, non-celebrity and or celebrities, that can help send that message in a more powerful, compelling way? The second category of motivator, it's fun, it's easy to do, and bonus, it has an impact. And this is a great motivator category to leverage when you need to get change started. It may not move change up the path as much, but it helps get people up and out of their seat and doing something often for the first time. So great as well for an audience that hasn't yet engaged in any kind of conservation or environmental related activities. This example is the partnership with Stella Artois and water.org. You buy a limited edition chalice and it gets 5 years of clean water for a family or a community. So for me, it's easy. All I have to do is buy this thing. It's also pretty fun as I get this cool thing that I get to show off to other people. Limited edition, not everybody has it. And bonus, it has an impact of providing clean water. It's really often easy for us as conservationists to kind of poo-poo these sort of things as saying, oh, well, people aren't really doing anything and it's still consumerism and they're still adding more things into their world, and are they really helping? And I get that. But I would encourage everyone to think of these as first steps, especially for those audiences that haven't engaged at all, and we need them to start paying attention a bit more. This gets their foot in the door and allows us to engage them further and maybe even work their way into more complex behaviors and changes that we need them to do over time. Some other examples of this: instilling a sense of play. So again, the fun aspect in reusing things that you have in the house. Instead of throwing them away or instead of buying more, you can add in a sense of playfulness and creativity that we may often be missing in how we describe the benefits of doing these behaviors. Events are a really fun way of engaging people. So something like Brew at the Zoo, which is growing nationally, if not globally, as an event many zoos offer. And this is a way to engage with audiences on an interest that's really meaningful to them and bring them into the conversation a bit more about wildlife conservation or other forms of environmental activities. So people like beer, bring them in on beer, engage them, let them have some fun, and then now they're part of this community that you can continue to reach out to. And the last example here for is fun and easy, and it has an impact. This is a donation example, which many of you may not be doing, but I do really like to show this example. This is Heifer International's website. And again, really what they're asking for is money. But they're talking about it as giving the gift of a goat, which is interesting, it's unique, it's something I'll probably tell my friends about. And it makes giving money a bit more playful. And that's something that we can really look to do. It just switch it up a little bit more to make it fun, easy, and know that I'm actually providing a family with something that's useful. So it does have that impact. Third category, I'm part of something bigger. And I share this photo for two reasons. There's actually two segments of I'm part of something bigger playing out here. One is co-creation, and that's when you can actively involve the audience in the planning and design of the project. So if you're working on a community-based program, there's opportunities to bring your audience into the early strategy planning and design stages. Have their inputs heard, have them involved in it, and that creates a sense of partnership, buy-in, and as well as the next one, endowment effect. And the endowment effect describes the concept that we place a greater value on things once we feel ownership over them. And this doesn't necessarily have to be things that we have paid to have ownership over, but just simply something that we feel connected to because we've had an involvement with it. And once there's this endowment effect, we feel a greater sense of responsibility and accountability for following through on the things that we said that we would. So these would be very, very powerful for creating that sense of responsibility and follow through. And so this picture here is from a project I worked on in the Philippines. And not only are they giving a commitment, which I'll talk about a bit more further, which is a great way of placing ownership and value on something, but also the t-shirts they're wearing has the project logo on it. And oftentimes projects do this. We have a logo, we make a shirt, we hand it out. This was done a bit differently, where individuals brought their own shirts and silkscreen the logo on it themselves. So this was something that they already had an endowment effect on, so their own shirt that they own, and then they themselves printed a logo on it. So they were part of that creation process. And all of that may seem like something small. All they did was put logos on shirts, but it created this sense of they are part of this, and therefore they need to help see through the success of this project. So some of these really, seemingly small things can have a very powerful impact. Belonging, creating a sense of belonging and responsibility is a big part of I'm part of something bigger. And I mentioned commitments before. Public pledges, public commitments, all of those things are very powerful in saying I'm part of this, which now means I have a responsibility to see it through. And I have a responsibility to help others who are part of this as well. So you're really building that community and building that movement. And I will add that the example on the bottom also plays into other people are doing it, the social proof aspect. 28,000 plus people have taken the pledge. So not only do I have a commitment once I've done it, but that motivates me to take the pledge in the first place. And all of this, No More, is a campaign against sexual assault and violence. And it uses multiple voices from relatable influencers to more celebrity influencers like Ice-T and NFL football players to send the message of no more tolerance for violence. A few more examples I want to share for I'm part of something bigger that we can leverage in our own work. One is on the left, Charity Water is a great organization to follow and to glean insights from. This is a bunch of people that bought a book. They wanted to read the book from Charity Water's CEO and founder, but it became more than just buying a book. It became about all those folks that contributed, that bought that book, actually helped unlock water for almost 6,000 people. So that not, buying a book is a fairly individual process, but it makes it into something bigger. Not only that I'm part of all these other people who did this action, but together we accomplished something really great. And all of that's very powerful. Again, it could be just to get someone's foot in the door and then engage them further, or to help validate their action so they're likely to repeat that action. I voted stickers are a great way of signaling that you're part of something bigger, as well as social proof. And using language like together and we. A lot of our messages in conservation tend to be you. You need to do this. You need to make a change. But we're all in this together. A lot of us, especially as conservationists, are also trying to make changes in our lives so we have a lower impact on the planet. So we can shift, and especially if you use influencers, to a we language. And that helps people feel like they are part of it and that they're not alone in this change or in this need to change. The last category is it benefits me personally. And this can be a tough one to achieve, but it's really, really important to understand our audiences and what's meaningful for them as a benefit in order to motivate them to make a change. I love this example, protect the crab cake population. The call to action here and the behavior change is to hold off on using lawn fertilizer until later in the year. And the reason being is because the rain affects it. It goes into storm drains, which goes into the waterways, which affects the crabs. And this ad doesn't get into any of that. And it doesn't really even talk about the crab habitat directly. It talks about the thing that people who live in this area of Maryland care about the most, and that is their crab cakes. They're very proud of their crab cakes, and they love their crab cakes. And they're more motivated to protect that, the actual food that they eat, the crab cake itself, then necessarily they would care about protecting the crabs, right? And our logic mind would say, well, of course they care about protecting the crabs because it relates to the crab cakes. But this cuts right through that and doesn't ask the audience to make that cognitive formula or add it all up. Just says, we know you love the crab cake, let's protect that population. And there's a few different kinds of benefits that we can look at to help leverage them in our communication and outreach. One is tangible benefits. So this is something the audience receives that they value as a result of doing the action or behavior. We tend to think of this purely as we provide a financial incentive, and that's not always the case. Tangible benefits can be quite a lot of other things, including greater health is a tangible benefit, and health is a very powerful one that we can use, as well as saving money. So we don't necessarily have to provide a financial incentive. There may be an inherent financial incentive in the things we're asking people to do, like reduce their food waste because it actually saves them money, or shop smarter in the first place so that they're not wasting money at the end of the day. So this whole example, I'm trying to remember the website. I think it's called savethefood.org. It talks about the connection between the money in your wallet and the food that you're wasting, more so than it being an environmental issue. And that's really important. It benefits our audience personally. Intrinsic benefits. So these are psychological and emotional rewards for doing the behavior. In many ways, it comes down to it makes them feel good. And they may feel good for different reasons than we think they should feel good. We might come at it as you should feel good because you're protecting the planet, you're doing something for the environment. But there's a lot of other intrinsic benefits that are even more meaningful for our audience. And when we can understand what those are, we can leverage those in our communication. Even things like doing this gives you a bit of good karma, a bit of good luck. Even those things are really powerful. And another part of intrinsic motivation or intrinsic benefits is helping our audience feel capable and empowered to do something different. Everybody wants to really be a better version of themselves. We all have these aspirations of self-improvement, and we can leverage that in our communication as well. We can help our audiences believe that they have the ability and the skills to make a change and to make a difference in a way that is meaningful for them. And this is a non-conservation example, but it's one that I really appreciate, is you don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent. And this was a whole campaign trying to encourage parents to adopt older kids from foster care. And they found through a lot of their research with their audiences that individuals who wanted to start families didn't adopt older children because they felt like they were ill-equipped to be a parent of a tween or a teenager. They just felt like since they hadn't raised a child from birth, they wouldn't have the skills they needed. And that's technically not true. All it really requires is a loving, stable household. And this whole campaign talked about you don't have to be perfect to be a perfect parent, and provided training and tools to help individuals feel that they were actually equipped and they actually could be the perfect parent to a child, a teenager in need. A great example of that, building self-efficacy and empowerment. So these are the 4 motivator groups that we can tap into in our communication and outreach efforts to help start those diffusion movements and help grow them and help sustain them. So we really want to get everyone through that curve as much as possible, up to the laggards. So again, as other people are doing it, it's easy and fun to do, and bonus, it has an impact, making our audience feel and believe that they are part of something bigger, and helping them see how it benefits them personally to take that action or that change, and remembering that it may not benefit them in the same way that we want it to, but we can still leverage that as a motivator. We can still achieve the same end goal through different means. I do want to touch on a few other things that can be used to help motivate change in action. And these stem very much from the field of behavioral economics, which has just been booming over the last 10 years. One piece is choice architecture, and oftentimes this is described as using nudges. And this is the practice of influencing choice by organizing the context in which people make decisions. And the example on the left really comes from a study of where you place salad in a buffet bar. And traditionally, salad would come at the end. You have the meat and everything else and the breads, and the salad is the last thing on the buffet line. And they did an experiment when they moved that salad to the front of the buffet line to see how much more people put salad on their plate, and then in turn, how does that actually affect the amount of other foods they put on their plate. That's, of course, starting with the assumption that salad is likely the healthiest thing in that buffet line. And they found that when they moved salad to the front, more people took salad and therefore took less of other foods that may have been less healthy for them. So just a shift in the actual architecture and the infrastructure and the layout shifted how people behaved in that setting and led to a healthier behavior overall. Some other examples here were, people, the example on the right, people may not know where the no smoking area is, or where the smoking area is, or where, 500 feet away from the door is smoking allowed. So instead of asking people to figure this out and do that research and homework on their own, you can just map it out, make it really cognitively easy for people to know where they should be and where they shouldn't be. The example on the bottom in the middle is literally walking people to where they need to dispose their cigarette butts. So making it as clear as possible, you go to this spot, similar with the escalator. Now, choice architecture can be very, very powerful if the action or behavior you're asking for is in a defined setting that you have some level of control over, so that you can actually design these kinds of interventions. I will say that these don't always translate into longer term behaviors outside of these settings. So although people took more salad in that buffet line, it didn't necessarily translate to them eating more salad in other places, in other times of their lives, or as a longer term behavior. It was pretty much constrained to that setting. So if that works for your project, cool, explore it, but it won't necessarily lead to other longer term shifts in behavior overall. Another aspect here under the umbrella of behavioral economics is defaults. Sometimes we talk about this as opt-outs. So default options are preset courses of action that take effect if nothing is specified by the decision maker. So this happens as a default. And setting defaults can be an effective nudge when there is inertia or uncertainty in decision making, and also when it's ethically appropriate to do so. An example here, I'll give an example from my own hometown, is where I get energy from. So, I moved to an area, I sign up with the local energy provider, and I get the energy from wherever they decide I get the energy from, I guess, or the electricity from. I'm not necessarily making those decisions when I sign up. There is a default setting. My city actually recently changed that default setting to be renewables, so that if you do nothing, whether you move here or you're already living here, your energy sources will come from renewable energy sources. And that's default. You would have to opt out of that in order to change it. And we have a lot of default settings around us that aren't necessarily most beneficial for the planet or for ourselves. But somebody at some point decided that that was going to be the default. And there's a really interesting movement now in shifting some of those defaults to be a bit more constructive, productive, and positive. And so it's important to see where we have that opportunity to do that. Smaller examples would be pre-checking boxes. So something like, providing carbon offsets on your flight, that could be pre-checked. So I have to uncheck that if I don't want to contribute to a carbon offset, or if you don't want to participate into something. So again, these tend to come in situations where you have control over these kinds of things, but it could be an option if you do have them. So bringing it all together, so the ingredients that can make your communication and outreach program awesome sauce is have a clear and specific ask. We didn't talk about that directly, but it's important to be really clear on what you're asking your audience to do. And once you have that ask, that call to action, look to see how can you make it easy and fun to do, how you can provide a sense of social proof that other people are doing this as well, how you can empower the audience and make them feel like change is possible and that they're a part of something bigger, and make those benefits personally meaningful to them. Now, you can look to find ways of incorporating all of these, or just incorporate one or a few of them once you have the clear and specific ask. Being clear and specific on your call to action is a deal breaker. You must have that no matter what. The other four you can play around with to see how you can combine them or incorporate them over time. And I do just want to give an example of how this actually plays out in a project I worked on in Mongolia. This was with World Wildlife Fund Mongolia, and the whole program was how do we make catch and release fishing, especially of a certain species called the taimen, the more popular social norm activity. This fishing activity was not based in livelihood. It was a recreational kind of sport fishing activity. So there wasn't a livelihood trade-off for this, which makes it a little bit of an easier call to action. And I want to show how we used a lot of these ingredients together to shift the norm from catch and keep to catch and release. So the first, as I mentioned, it's important to have a clear and specific ask. This was one of the first posters we came out with. If you catch taimen, take a picture and release it. And when we talked about descriptive norms before, no fishermen in this area were currently fishing like this. So when we were thinking about how do we show this behavior and demonstrate it, we decided our best course of action was to have it illustrated and drawn, since we didn't have any real-life examples of this behavior happening. So this poster shows the proper handling techniques, the taking a picture, which is a part of the call to action, and then in the bottom right, the proper releasing of the fish back into the water. And then we made it easy and fun to do. We engaged the fishermen into fisher clubs and taught them how to bend the hooks on their barb so it would be safer for taimen to use. We gave them fun posters to hand out and made it an engagement activity, something they could feel like they were a part of. When we could, we did provide that social proof. So even at the beginning of the project, we didn't have examples of fishers doing that behavior, but eventually we did. And when we did, we took pictures of those fishers doing that same behavior and used them in the communication and outreach materials. So this is a billboard in one of the towns that features a fisher from that town doing the new social norm. And that was very, very powerful. People love to see people they know up in billboards. We empowered the audience by giving them more and more skills. So those fishers then became certified guides. So they could get paid by tourists who wanted to fish in their area. So they now had that additional skill set, and they were part of this process from the beginning. So they had the co-creation and endowment effect. And then they also felt empowered to make a change and to be stewards of their natural resources. And lastly, we made it personal. We tapped into this sense of pride around this species that really doesn't exist in many other places, and brought in the entire wider community around this sort of rally cry of let's protect the species because it's so important. And this was an example in one program. The whole program lasted 2 years. The campaign was 1 year long, where we were able to bring in all these different elements at different times. And as a result, in that first summer of fishing, we received 250 photos of fishermen that showed them releasing those taimen that they caught back into the river. It greatly increased discussions among fishers about the importance of doing this behavior. And peer-to-peer communication is so valuable in increasing that diffusion curve and moving audiences up it. And ultimately, we saw a nearly 50% increase in taimen population in that first year, just after that year of campaigning. So I wanted to share all of this to say there are so many things we can leverage to motivate our audiences and really move those movements forward and grow them in a way that they can become new habits and new norms. And I hope this has been fun. I hope it's been inspiring. And please let me know if you have any questions. You can reach me at brooke@brooketully.com. And I always have a ton of more resources at my website at brooketully.com. Thank you so much.